thank you, Stephen, really for the invite. And very much this is a personal view and a personal journey of the last few months, basically. And what I hope to do is talk you both about the Bawa-Garba case, how I got involved with it, some of the things that the team did, and actually how the implications are of actually even still. Okay. This is not going to work, so I'm going to have to go over here. Oh, no, it's working. Yeah. So a bit of background to me. I'm a consultant neurologist at City Hospital, but I'm also college tutor at the QE. And I actually think, how many of you have read Black Box Thinking? Okay. Honestly, I feel like taking to Waterson's now and getting a copy of it, a book by Matthew Syed. And if you want to understand risk and error, and actually how learning from mistakes is a really, really good way to become better at whatever you do, whether that's table tennis, in Matthew Syed's context, or neurology if you're me. And part of this actually goes back some years ago. We did a study looking at how infrequently people got examined neurologically. It was pretty depressing when we identified things like you're more likely to be examined at Queen Square with a stethoscope than a Queen Square tendon hammer. So we actually did quite a lot of work on this, and the reason this is relevant to gross negligence manslaughter is because of the Honeyrose case. You may recall the optometrist that got convicted of gross negligence manslaughter. Well, in fact, this has literally just come out today in the BMJ, which is the background of this, about some very basic education skills to learn about examination of the eye. And it happens because of the Honeyrose case, because I became really worried that, so the background to this is an optometrist who did an examination of a child who basically dropped dead 5 months later, had no symptoms essentially at the time of the eye examination, and died of hydrocephalus. Now, she got convicted of gross negligence manslaughter. The reason this case is really important is it got overturned a year after our Times letter. I don't think that had anything to do with it, but over 4,000 optometrists and others signed a letter we had in the Times about this. So a lot of people were really worried about the implications of this case. The implication would apply to not just to optometrists, but radiologists, anyone where you did a test and the patient died at some other point. And the appeal court came across with a very important judgment, was that there had to be foreseeability at the time of the alleged offence. Okay, you had to have some foreseeability that the patient could come through to harm through your neglect, and that's a really, really important concept if you're thinking about gross negligence manslaughter. So the Honeyrose case, although it was about an optometrist, has got great relevance to all healthcare professionals. And part of the reason I mentioned this was before the appeal happened, I was actually giving a talk at the Royal Society of Medicine about black box thinking in medicine, and I became aware of a case remarkably similar, I have to say, to the Honeyrose case, where basically a woman in her 40s got admitted to hospital, not in Birmingham, okay, but with vomiting. They thought it was psychological, suggested getting a psychologist referred, and then eventually started becoming comatose. Penny dropped, had an extensor plantar. The patient had a colloid cyst and hydrocephalus and died, basically. And the coroner at the inquest became aware of the earlier study I did about patients not being examined, and issued a Regulation 28 that lessons to be learned from this case. Wrote to the President Royal College of Physicians, GMC and others, who ended up writing to me and saying, yes, they should have examined the patient, but in fact all neurologists know that if someone develops acute hydrocephalus, they may not have actually developed papilledema at the time. And I was actually giving a talk on this case at the RSM in front of the CPS and the GMC, so I was pretty scared, which is why all the slides are redacted. Immediately I gave the talk, I deleted the talk and took it away. Okay, I think that concept of fear is not what we should be trying to encourage. And in fact, the whole idea of Regulation 28 from the coroner is that the coroner issues them because they want people to learn. And still today you can't find that Regulation 28, even though it's meant to be out in the public domain. So, which is one of the aspects I think we need to see reform, is the way the coroners work. Now, the background also to the Bara-Garba case is people, we're really worried that juniors are potentially leaving the country, and my answer to that is actually this is a problem all over the world. Okay, this is just this year going from left: Denmark, Russia, Kenya, Mexico, all cases of doctors or they're either being accused of murder or or the local equivalent gross negligence manslaughter on the basis of error. So there's actually a society thing we need to deal with in terms of our conversation with the public, that actually we deal with risk. And sometimes we will do things which will actually cause harm to the patient, not because we mean to cause harm, we're actually trying to do our best, but things go wrong. This is something which I think the lawyers, the CPS, the police and others need to get a concept to, because it's actually altering behaviour. We can perhaps talk about this in the discussion. So how did I get the background to this? Well, and before we, I think it's important to actually talk about some positive news. Next to me is Jenny Vaughn, another neurologist who I've known for 25 years. Ironically, we both did PhDs in the genetics of Parkinson's disease, and believe it or not, obsession to detail and tracking things down is exactly what you need when you're looking at gross negligence manslaughter and miscarriages of justice. So I actually think having a neurologist on your case is probably quite a good thing to do. Jenny knows more about gross negligence manslaughter than anyone, because she was involved in the David Nicholl case. Talking about sticking up for colleagues, she helped crowdsource 50 grand for a new legal team which overturned the conviction for David Nicholl, who went to prison, okay, that got overturned. That's only the second time in English legal history that has ever happened, okay? I'm going back to the 13th century, okay? So it's no surprise that Jenny won the Crime Team of the Year award. She's not a lawyer this year, the Modern Law Awards, okay? So, but an important thing to realise that something has happened since then is actually no healthcare professionals have been charged with gross negligence manslaughter since that successful appeal. And I think that's something, although everyone's very nervous and panicky about the Bawa-Garba case, that's a really important point to come across, is actually, I think the CPS are beginning to realise, this takes up a lot of time, a lot of money, and the hit rate is actually quite poor. Now this, in fact, this was Jenny. I was chairing this session at a joint meeting a couple of weeks ago with the Association of British Neurologists and Society of British Neurological Surgeons. Boy, if you want to meet an angry group of doctors, they were livid at what's happened with Bara-Garba. And I think it's actually, whatever specialty you're in, the closer you are to the front door, and therefore the greatest level of risk, I think the more angry people are about this. But some things you just need to know about gross negligence manslaughter. What does this mean? Well, first, you have to owe a duty of care to the patient. Two, there has to be a negligent breach. Thirdly, and this is relevant to the Honeyrose case, it needs to be reasonably foreseeable that the breach gave rise to a serious and obvious risk of death. And clearly, the patient had to have died, okay? The breach had to cause death. And the circumstances of the breach were truly exceptionally bad, okay? Those are the words that would be used in court, and so reprehensible as to justify the conclusion that it amounted to gross negligence and required criminal sanctions. So it's worth just thinking about that phrasing and that wording, basically. But really importantly, 90% of the cases investigated are not prosecuted. I'm talking about healthcare. When you compare this to the national conviction rate for ordinary gross negligence manslaughter not involving healthcare professionals is 80%, okay? Whereas the gross negligence manslaughter for medicine is less than half of that, at 23 to 30%. So, although everyone's very nervous about this, if you were unlucky enough to be charged with gross negligence manslaughter, your likelihood of being convicted is actually much less than non-medics, okay? That's because these cases are complicated, and that's actually because doctors are there to help people. We're not actually trying to kill people. It may not seem like that the way the media sometimes reports this. This was a letter in the BMJ, I have to say, from my brother and others. My brother's a consultant neonatologist. Over 150 paediatricians said they would be quite happy for Adisa Bawa-Garba to come to their department and work in their department, which I think is a fascinating and very powerful statement, bearing in mind she still has a conviction for gross negligence manslaughter. Let's go back to 1329, okay? I'm very grateful for Ian Barker from the MDU, okay? Ian Barker is exactly the kind of solicitor you want in your case if he goes out to dig out a document in Norman French and get it translated, okay? This was the first case of a doctor who was being charged of gross negligence manslaughter. The judge, who was called Devon, said he had a man under his care who died, and it was found that he did not do the thing with criminal intent but involuntarily, so the judge commended him to God. Okay? I think they had more idea in 1329 than they had in 2018. He was found not guilty. Okay? So, lovely bit of history. So how did I get involved with this? Well, obviously I was interested in gross negligence manslaughter because of the whole Honeyrose case. But I think a lot of us last year, really because of the work of Jenny, Jonathan Cusack and others, became aware that there was a really very serious miscarriage of justice, that the GMC were about to screw up big time. And when they say that they were surprised at this is just not true, okay? I was one of several hundred doctors that wrote to the GMC on more than one occasion last year and warned them that what they were about to do was particularly stupid, okay? So actually, they deserve all the criticism they get now and more, okay? So I went to the High Court in December last year, and in fact was sat right behind Nicholl Alcock. And you know, I think we should say, you know, all of us are really very sorry and very regretful for what the Alcock family have gone through, because it has been hellish. In fact, this whole process is completely toxic. But it's been toxic to everyone concerned, both the Alcocks, Bawa-Garba, and I would have to say, because of the ongoing concern about this, to actually every doctor in the country. But I became aware, largely because I asked Bawa-Garba form, and basically the training encounter form, and also had an unredacted copy of the serious untoward incident form. Basically, I did what I could to get this information to the public domain. But I didn't want to get sued. That's important. You don't want to get sued. Okay, I'll explain the reasons why that matters a lot. What I did not know, okay, I wasn't at the trial. Okay, I didn't have the trial transcript. Okay, I'd been stalking the GMC so much I started getting LinkedIn ads for would I like to join the GMC when hell freezes over. Okay, but I think if any of you who've seen the Panorama programme, I basically sent all the documents I had. There was one journalist I knew that would cover the story and cover the story well, and that was Deb Cohen, whose investigations editor at the BMJ. So I suppose if my role in Team Hadiza was probably getting some of the media interest to start off with. And the Panorama programme did have access to all the court documents, okay? And to be absolutely clear, the reflections were used in the court process, contrary to what you've been told. I'll come on to that in just a bit. I really can't go on any further without acknowledging the role of Jonathan Cusack, okay? None of you would be sat here today without Jonathan Cusack. He was the only consultant in Leicester that stood up for Hadiza, okay? And I think there's a strong lesson for all of us, is that actually when we see our juniors in effect being bullied, okay, by another consultant and in effect the trust, we have a responsibility to put our hand up and stand above the parapet. Jonathan Cusack did that and some, okay? And in fact, a question I've got is actually how many other Bara-Garbas are there that no one's ever heard of? I mentioned about not getting sued. Peter Wilmshurst, cardiologist in Stoke, described by Private Eye as the godfather of whistleblowers, okay? This man has got big balls, okay? He's referred more doctors to the GMC than anyone else, okay? Including his own boss, okay? For research fraud, okay? And actually something I learned from Peter Wilmshurst, you may recall, he was involved in a clinical trial called the MISS-2 trial in migraine, basically looking at putting stents in to try and reduce the risk of migraine. It was a negative trial. He reported the results in an American cardiology website as a negative trial. He was the principal investigator to it. The manufacturers of the device decided to sue him for libel in an English libel court, okay? Now, he may have won the case, but he won the case, but the company's share price plummeted, so he was potentially faced with a bill of several £100,000, basically, and bankruptcy, had to remortgage his house, basically. So he's got serious balls, okay? But he taught me one thing was, if you got something which is legally contentious, you might get sued, send it to the BMJ, they get it legaled, okay? Which is why everything I'm going to say is in the public domain, largely in the BMJ, because I don't want to get sued, okay? It's something I've learned over the years on several stories I've been involved in. This is a story I did about orphan drugs, where a drug company was essentially ripping off the NHS. I sent all the documents to the BMJ, published it. Very topical if you think what's happened with Lucentis and macular degeneration recently. It's totally relevant to this story about essentially drugs which don't have a license but are clinically indicated. And in fact, I was a registrar once. I was a neurology registrar in Coventry at exactly the same time as Raj Mathu. I had similar real concerns about patient safety. I have to say great parallels with the whole Chris Day case, which is happening this week. In Coventry at the time, they had a policy of never closing the hospital. They'd squeeze patients in. I had a patient who had myasthenia, who nearly arrested, and we couldn't get to them. And I wrote, at the time, I was just a registrar, I wrote to the chief executive who said, oh yeah, it's terrible, that's the way it is. I thought this is just not a safe environment. I didn't know that Raj Mathu was doing exactly the same thing. But the lesson here is keep good records. I still have copies of the SUI and everything from 20 years ago from this case. When I heard that he'd been hounded by the trust, I sent all of it to his lawyers basically. That was one of the most expensive employment tribunals in history. I had no sanction whatsoever. Maybe it's because I'm white, I don't know. That settled for £10 million. Absolutely appalling case, basically. Anyway, I've sent all the documents to the BMJ, so even if you write a blog for the BMJ, they will get it legal. Having sent the stuff to Deb Cohen at the BMJ, so the stories that appeared in November last year essentially were based on the serious incident form and the reflection form that we'll go into some more detail. And then we wrote to the Times. Nearly 800 of us wrote to the Times, basically warning at the time, we urged the GMC to recognise that many within and outside medicine are already losing confidence in that in this case could define its future. I would say that was prophetic. After that appeared in the Times, I remember being phoned up by the Daily Mail, forgive me, I said, I'm not going to speak to the Daily Mail unless you read the BMJ. You need to understand the word enalapril, okay? Fair play, the Daily Mail did read the BMJ, and basically I've actually a very good story on it. And what I said at the time, it was a tragedy, but the GMC have turned it into a disaster. As a result of that, in fact, bizarrely, I mentioned about black box thinking earlier. Matthew Syed, who wrote Black Box Thinking, is a columnist for the Times, and rang me up. I sent him the same material I had for the BMJ, and if you want to read a good lay summary of what happened, I think this is the best example. I'm just going to go through this in some detail, because I think there are strong parallels that, people probably are writing PhDs about this case in terms of human factors and everything else in time to come. And what I didn't realise is the hero of British neurology, William Gowers, was clearly an early black box thinker. This was a paper he had in 1894 talking about his mistakes. It's always pleasant to be right, but it's generally a much more useful thing to be wrong, because that's how you learn. Whereas Matthew said, no, I would say failure is the best way to learn. And if we think about this, and I still think, basically we need to keep beating the GMC to realise the effect they're having on doctors at the moment. We need to be getting into the left-hand success side of things, whereas I think a lot of us feel we're in the frustration, I'm frustrated and give up, I don't know, and when I fail I'm no good, and this kind of negative thinking is actually having a direct impact on patient care. So let's think about the kind of parallel. I mean, there's lots of parallels about the airline industry, and I'm going to give you some of this just because none of us are trying to say that doctors should be immune from the law, okay? The law is there for a reason, but the law must not be an ass, okay? It must be used appropriately. We want to get rid of the Ian Pattersons of this world who bring medicine into disrepute. We should not be punishing people who make honest mistakes. If a doctor turns up to work drunk, you'll be struck off, okay? If a pilot turns up to work drunk, he won't be allowed to fly the plane, he'll be arrested. It's not any different. But I think if you compare what happens in the airline industry with what happens in the Bawa-Garba case, it's really quite enlightening. And this was the analogy that Matthew Syed in his article, and it's all about human factors. So I'll just tell you about this one flight that happened in 1972 in Florida, a flight between New York and Miami. And on descent, the pilot was flying down and noticed that the wheel alarm wasn't working. Kept knocking it, sort of maybe something not right with it, started chatting with the co-pilot. They got absolutely obsessed about this, basically either the light was faulty or the wheel wasn't down, but they had to know the answer. otherwise they're going to crash the plane. Okay? So going in a holding pattern around the Everglades, trying to work out what's going wrong with the plane. At the same time, the autopilot becomes disengaged. Okay? So the completely fixation error focused on trying to sort out this light. The plane is circling around, the autopilot disengaged, crashes in the Everglades, and 101 people killed. Okay? This wasn't the first time this happened. Classic example of fixation error. But we know from Martin Bromley and others exactly the kind of fixation errors also happen in healthcare. And the comparison that Matthew said made in his Times article was the Bawa-Garba case, looking at what happened here. And this is the kind of stuff that expert witnesses ought to know about, but don't. Okay? All of us who are working doctors are aware of cognitive bias. When we're tired, when we're hungry, when we're overworked, we screw up and we're more likely to make mistakes. So we think about what happened with the Jack Alcock case. 6-year-old with Down syndrome admitted to Leicester Royal Infirmary in February, admitted to diarrhea and vomiting. Let's think a little bit about the errors that were made, and Hadiza has always been honest about her errors, basically. First of all, the preliminary diagnosis, assuming that it was gastroenteritis when it was due to sepsis, perhaps underestimated the role of oxygen, and also that it was dehydrated, urea and creatinine were higher than they should have been, and also this issue about the raised lactate, venous lactate. Lactate 11 would ring alarm bells. But, and this is really important, you need to understand the mitigating factors. The consultant was away, okay, so he was in Warwick when he should have been in Leicester. They were down by a registrar. There was a major IT failure. The SHO was delegated the phone for 4 hours on the phone trying to get results. She just returned from maternity leave for 13 months. She'd had no induction. She was covering 6 hospital wards across 4 floors. She was having to do a lumbar puncture on a child with meningitis. She had another child in status epilepticus. She missed the morning handover because she was dealing with a cardiac arrest. Okay, she worked for over 10 hours without any breaks. Okay, and at 4:30, the consultant swans up for the handover and was told the lactate result and suggested might be a lab error, partly because the child had actually picked up around 3:30, was having a drink and seemed to be improving a little bit. But crucially, the enalapril, because this child had a cardiac defect related to his Down syndrome, and the hospital at the time had a policy that parents could carry on giving the drugs without it being prescribed. The child was given enalapril, and he then died at 8:20. Okay, so huge system problems, lots of other problems, lots of staffing problems. And I have to say, reading this, I'm actually surprised that there wasn't more than one child died on that day, to be honest, because I think her workload was truly exceptional. And what was truly exceptional bad was the working environment that she was in. So having been aware of that environment, and I'll show the reflection form as well, we sent all this to the BMJ and pointed out that Reardon took the notes, typed them up, then BMJ has seen the form, I'll show it to you in a moment. It suggests that factors that let down her interpretation of biochemistry and venous blood gases and her lack of clear communication. This doesn't project very well, but this is the reflection form, and I think it's really important to understand the circumstances in which this was taken, because my jaw dropped reading this form. And the first reason was you read it and realise that she never signed it. Okay, this was a form that was written by Reardon, who was the consultant on call. Okay, and Hadiza Bawa-Garba refused to sign it, okay, because she felt under duress, okay. They met in the canteen 5 days after Jack Alcock's death, so a completely inappropriate environment. Sat her down in the canteen, and basically Reardon asked her to take her through her errors. Completely the wrong way to give feedback, completely wrong environment. And also what is interesting, if you look at this form, it says different items. Point number 3, parents' feedback. Dr. Bawa was excellent at all times, which reads very strangely, bearing what we now know in terms of what the family's view was of Dr. Bawa-Garba. Now, she had already met the family and had apologised. She was then not allowed to speak to the family ever again. I'll leave it for the rest of you to work out what may have happened. None of us know, but it seems like someone got stitched up. So as I said, it was never signed. And the top part is Reardon's writing. It's this underlined lack of clear communication. Okay, that to me reads like an argument rather than feedback. Okay. Now it is true to say this was not put in front of the jury. Okay, but it was used by the prosecution QC. And bear in mind, Reardon was a prosecution witness. Okay, And the first questions that the prosecution QC said at the trial was to Bawa-Garba, tell me your mistakes. Okay? So the jury were not aware that this document was used for cross-examination, but that's the way it was, basically. Now, I think this is really important, because I think this is something, although there's been lots of advice about how we should encourage feedback, and I still say that reflection is really important. But if I caught any education supervisor acting in this way to any trainee, believe me, that would be the last day they are supervisor, okay? Because this is bullying and harassment, okay? There is no way, sitting in a canteen 5 days after a child has died, this is an appropriate way to deal with any doctor, at all, okay? And indeed, if you go to the serious incident form, as I've done, it goes into quite some length. In fact, this is in the public domain, but I have actually got an unredacted copy. And the summary is probably the most important thing. It actually says it's not possible to identify a single cause because this case is so complex. Now, the serious incident form was not shown to the jury, and exactly the same thing happened in the David Nicholl case, the surgeon that got convicted of manslaughter. And part of this is because the interpretation of the law that basically they will consider all aspects that led to the death of that patient, but will not consider any of the aspects that happened afterwards. And I know that may seem strange. It seems strange because, in fact, when things go wrong, that's one of the first things we do, is actually try and analyse what went wrong, go through a serious incident process and try and understand. But in law, both in the Nicholl case and also the Bara-Garba case, the SUI was not shown to the jury. There are errors in the SUI. For example, it says that medical staffing levels were within normal limits. That's certainly being generous with the English language, bearing in mind what we now know, that the consultant was actually in Warwick when he should have been in Leicester, that the registrar was down, so there are inaccuracies with the SUI. But I think that summary, if the jury had known that, there is no way I can see how they would have convicted. So what's happening as a result? Well, doctors are scared. I know as a college tutor, because the trainees come to me and talk about it. There's a very real risk on high-risk specialties, and I'm really worried about the effect on this. You know, all of us are going to need to see a doctor at some stage. If I, God forbid, fall, bash my head and get a subdural, I want a neurosurgeon to come and sort me out. So there's a worry that this is going to have an effect on high-risk specialties. But actually, the one thing that has happened, even greater than the junior doctor strike, is that the profession is probably united in a way that's been the case greater than at any other stage in my career. And that, in part, that's because there's been a breach of trust. There's been a breach of trust between the patient and the doctor, between the trainee and the trainer, between the employee and the employer, and now between the profession and the regulator. And I think it is worth thinking about the defendants in the gross negligence manslaughter trials, because there is clearly a disproportionate number of prosecutions against non-white practitioners, around 50%. And indeed, in the last 10 years, all of the convictions have been exclusively from healthcare professionals of BME origin. But I think you need to be careful with this. It's obviously low numbers, but it is a real concern, a potential risk of racial bias, and this is something which I know is being looked at, but I think it is a concern. I don't know, is this learn not blame? And I have to say, I was pretty angry the day I was outside the GMC tearing up my GMC certificate. I'll point out my brother, much as I love him, wasn't tearing up his certificate. Very nice photograph, but he wasn't tearing up his certificate. Was this learn not blame or blame not learn? I'll leave that for you to think about. And part of the reason I was so angry actually was because of stuff that Peter Wilmshurst, I mentioned, the cardiologist earlier, had written. And actually it was the sex offender issue that really got my goat. And there's actually been very little coverage on this, and I think it is worth discussing. I wrote at length to Terence Stevens. In fact, I sent this letter along with the torn up GMC certificates and the reflection form to tell the GMC that the reflections were used in court, as well as a lengthy letter talking about the stuff that Peter Wilmshurst had already written to BMJ about the fact that GMC, for example, had taken no action against 100 doctors placed on the sex offenders register for accessing child porn. It just seems bizarre, okay, that the GMC is more lenient on potential paedophiles than a paediatrician having a bad day at work, okay? This just seems something fundamentally wrong with the regulator. To show you how bad it is, okay, I'm aware of a consultant within the West Midlands who was going for a Silver Clinical Excellence Award, who was on the sex offenders register, who was being supported by a current member of GMC Council for a Silver Clinical Excellence Award, okay? absolutely unbelievable, okay? And I've had nothing to refute that statement, which again came in an article that Peter Wilmshurst wrote in the BMJ. And these are a particular group of people, I would say sex offenders and those guilty of research fraud, are the real crooks we need kicking out of medicine, because they're very likely to be repeat offenders. Whereas you take a paediatrician like Hadiza Bawa-Garba, who everyone has accepted was a brilliant doctor every day at work, apart from that one day when Jack Alcock died, and everyone has agreed he was a very good doctor every day after that, okay? So there's just something fundamentally wrong about the system that is that inconsistent. So all of that I have sent to the Health Select Committee, who I believe are meeting on October 16th. I sincerely hope they consider this evidence along with everything else. So in fact, in response to that letter, I had this reply from Charlie Massie, basically saying a couple of different things. I'll just focus on things that they had to rely on the issue about reflection from those who represented Bara-Garba and represented the Crown. When I raised the issue about the sex offenders, said that we now always call for the doctor to be struck off the register for such serious offences. Unfortunately, both of those statements are incorrect. Okay. Part of the stuff that was in the BMJ, 8th of February, the NPS, the Medical Practitioner Service, who were basically Hadiza Bawa-Garba's legal team at the time, acknowledged, however, that may well have been the case that the reflections, as the BMJ has stated, fed into the trial. Okay. I point out, not once, okay, since all the stuff I sent to the BMJ in November last year, have the GMC or the NPS refuted any of the material that's been put out. They've been very keen to send to every other journal, Pulse and everything else, trying to say that reflections weren't used, okay? But generally, if there's a problem with the story, you speak to the journalist that wrote the story, okay? And the reason I also say about the sex offender issue is, in fact, my brother, as I said, is a paediatrician, emailed the Professional Standards Authority. For those of you who don't know, the Professional Standards Authority is the regulator of regulators. And so, in fact, the PSA has got the ability to appeal MPTS decisions, basically. And quite remarkably, they said, we recently appealed a GMC case where a doctor had a conviction for sexual assault and was on the sex offenders register. The MPTS suspended him for a year. The GMC did not appeal, but we succeeded in having a raise. So the previous statement that Charlie Massie said was incorrect. Obviously, I don't know the name of the doctor, but I have pointed this all out. Which is why I had, again, a letter to the BMJ back in February saying, and this is why the BMJ is very good, because I love it when the BMJ says, oh, we have to get this legaled. Excellent, okay? So the lawyers checked this, so has the chair of the Health Select Committee misled of the Bawa-Garba case? Those of you who are GMC registered will remember that you had an email from the GMC saying that reflections weren't used. We know that's not true. At no stage have I had an apology since. There was this kind of spinning that happened from the NPS, saying that an NPS spokesperson also said Dr. Bawa-Garba did indeed meet duty consultant O'Riordan after Jack's death to discuss the incident and learnings. This is standard practice. Well, I've described to you what happened. Meeting in a hospital canteen 5 days after the death, forcing the trainee to try and sign a form which they refused to. It is not standard practice. As I said, it's bullying and harassment. So that was in Pulse at the end of January. Having gone through my anger moment of tearing up the certificate, we can talk about this. I did think about this, and I do passionately believe in learning, not blaming. And I kind of felt like calling for Charlie Massie's at that stage resignation was perhaps inappropriate, because what I really want to see is the Health Select Committee question Charlie Massie about why they did the action they've done. That hasn't happened yet, but will be happening October 16th in the afternoon, if you're free. Just yesterday, let's talk about the way forward. This is a letter which is just coming out in the BMJ, where I've basically kind of summarised this, saying how the GMC has failed its job as a regulator. We need a public inquiry, at the very least, a detailed analysis by the Health Select Committee on why it took its actions. So that's where we are. But let's just move on, because I think there are positive things to come through with this. This is on the Health Select Committee website. A lot of people are concerned about this, because there basically is a lack of working doctors who are witnesses on it. I know that the Royal College of Physicians are submitting written evidence. I imagine the BMA will be as well, but I would encourage you, if you can, I think that room should be full of doctors looking at Charlie Massie in the eye. But let's just think a little bit about healthcare with the airline industry again. I just want to We've talked about the Jack Alcock case. I'm going to skip through. I don't know how many of you are aware of the showroom air show incident. This happened a few years ago in August 2015. If you remember, the pilot that tried to do a loop-the-loop and crashed into the runway. Really important lessons, believe it or not, for healthcare in terms of what happens with gross negligence manslaughter. So as you can see, I think 11 men died in that incident. And if you think of the approach in the airline industry when they investigate an accident, completely different to what happens in healthcare. Initially, the police wanted to try and get the interviews that the Air Investigation Bureau had with the pilot, and the Air Investigation Bureau took the police to court, said, no, you can't have our investigations because it's so important that there's an independent analysis of what happened in the accident, that to involve a criminal process would be completely wrong. And the High Court backed that. Could you ever picture the GMC taking PC Plod to court to protect reflections? I mean, just a different planet. And in fact, the High Court wisely refused, ruling that such disclosure would have a serious and chilling effect that would deter pilots from being candid. And that's exactly the problem we've got. We need to think a little bit about, we want to be honest when things go wrong so that we can learn. That's so important. So in fact, if you look, you can find the Air Investigation report. It's all on the web, so none of this stuff like the problems I had with Regulation 28, it's all publicly available. You can see what they came to conclusions, and they concluded that pilot errors led to the crash, but their wording is so different from it, and it's all very neutral. It's thinking, could there be mitigating factors? Was the sun shining in his eyes when he was doing the loop? But he acknowledged that he went into the loop too fast and too low. So very neutral language, but concluded that it came to pilot error. They even have a nice little video showing you, a reconstruction of what happened. I think someone ought to do a reconstruction of the Bawa-Garba case. And I think there's so much could potentially be learned, basically. So they've gone through all that. They've gone through a process, okay? And what I think is interesting is he now has been charged with gross negligence manslaughter. It'll be really interesting to see what happens. Obviously, there's a sub judice, but I think what was interesting was the lawyers for the families recognised the importance of just culture, and that is really what we need to talk a little bit when we're talking about healthcare. I mean, this is not a local paper talking about just culture. We'll come on to that in a minute. And just culture is, if you've ever read any of the work of Sidney Dekker, who's talked a lot about this, is culture in which frontline operators and others are not punished for actions, omissions or decisions, essentially honest error, taken by them which are commensurate with their experience and training, and where gross negligence, willful violations and disruptive acts are not tolerated. That doesn't mean a get out of jail card. It's basically understanding what went wrong. And also, I think further than that, it's actually what we really want to be trying to get in healthcare, I would say, is what I would call a restorative culture. And that's really answering 3 questions. The 3 questions are: 1, who are hurt? 2, what do they need? And 3, whose obligation is it to meet that need? I'm just going to play this, we've got time to show a really good video explaining about this in healthcare, because I think it's just understanding about trying to think about blame, because the first thing that usually happens when things go wrong, we think, oh God, what did I do wrong? But this is a video that Sidney Dekker did about just culture in Merseyside.
Our core in Merseycare is behavioural health, from core talking therapies right through to one of 3 high secure mental health hospitals.
It's challenging, busy, quite often dangerous.
Patients thought things were crawling all over them.
People don't really understand them. What I've done is try and help to make that better.
Coming into the health sector, you have to recognise how things work.
I was involved in a recent incident where I'd made a mistake.
The sort of the management culture was quite an intimidating kind of bullying management system.
It's really easy when you're in our jobs to ask, I wonder who was at the back of that.
You looked at the data on a piece of paper, you looked at the numbers as numbers, and you go into a clinical environment and those numbers become people.
I was informed that there was allegations made against me.
And HR's response was, well, you're actually under investigation. That was the first I knew of it.
I wasn't sort of ready and expecting the response from the trust to suspend the staff.
The day I was suspended was the worst day of my working life.
So there's really two ways in which you can do just culture. Right? One would be a retributive way. You ask questions like, what rule is broken and what should the consequences be? And it's all focused on the individual who's the supposed offender.
The staff felt proven guilty without trial.
You question your professionalism, everything you've learned, everything you've got.
It's just the most horrendous time of my life and my family's life.
It is a political system. It's target driven.
Well, there were 3 deaths, 3 separate wards, no real correlation or link between any of them.
But we got to a point that we thought we've got to change the way we do this.
And of course, naturally, we scratch our heads and say, but we don't have a blame culture.
The real challenge is that you cannot buy a just culture off the shelf. It doesn't work that way. Creating a just restorative culture is a hard and long slog.
So, in fact, we can think about this, even in relation to the Bawa-Garba case, by going through these 3 questions. We can think about who were hurt. Well, that's what do they need and whose obligation. So obviously, there's the Alcock family. Also, there's the Bawa-Garba. Dr. Bawa-Garba. So I've got 1, 2, 4. But also think about what they need, and that essentially you do need to think about money. So you need to think about compensation, but also you need to think about improved systems, safe environment, and whose obligations to meet that need. Well, that's all of us. It's also the state. I think there's different models. We haven't really got time to think about this, but I've had 2 words. It would be New Zealand, and think about the kind of no-fault compensation system that happens in New Zealand. And actually the responsibility on all of us in terms of safe reporting, but also thinking about staffing levels. But compare this approach to the Bara-Garba case. We have an adversarial approach. Someone has to be blamed rather than understand the cause first. There's huge variation, expert witnesses, coroners, Crown Prosecution Service, police, no independent evaluation of the case. If you think about this in the serious incident reporting compared to what I said to the Air Investigation Bureau, very neutral language. Human factors are absolutely key. It's the bread and butter of the Air Investigation Bureau. And it's all about establishing the cause, not blame. Okay. I've even just heard today, GMC still coming up with the same guff. This was a few months ago, but the same kind of thing in a reflection wasn't used. I actually showed this to Charlie Massie in a talk and say, this is fake news, basically. This is a really useful document. So in fact, I think if you get a chance to look at NHS Improvement, Just Culture, you can just Google it. I haven't got time to go through it here, but it's a very good document. And I think, honestly, if anyone doing an investigation, if they had this document and looked at the notes for the Bawa-Garba case, there is no way this would have come to trial. It's just thinking about, was there evidence of deliberate harm? Was there a health test? So was she drunk or on drugs? Okay. Was there foresight? So was there reasonable foresight for what could have happened? Are there other indications? Had they got previous form and things? So it's actually common sense stuff. But think about neutral language. So I think this is a very useful document. I know people can criticise some of the bureaucracy that comes out of NHS Improvement. This is a really useful document. So going back in April, GMC saying we're sorry. This, in fact, was today in Pulse. I and others from Doctors Association and others basically calling on the Health Secretary to stop the GMC going through this process, because I don't mean to worry you, but actually nothing has changed since the Bawa-Garba appeal. Okay, they're still appealing to NPDS panels, going to the High Court and then getting those overturned at the appeal court. So nothing has changed, and nothing will change until Parliament changes the law. Okay, which is why you need to get really angry about this and write to your MPs. And keep putting pressure on this. Because in fact, Pulse has already revealed that GMC is not intending to halt appeals against NPTS decisions, bearing in mind the NPTS is meant to be independent until the law is changed. And the analogy I would make is this would be like the Civil Aviation Authority asking me to review their decisions to strike off a pilot on the basis that I've flown as a passenger on a plane. Okay, that is bonkers. Okay, you need people to understand flying, just in the same way with medicine, you need to understand what an Anapril is. So I was thinking back about this. This year is the 500th anniversary of the Royal College of Physicians, something I'm very proud of. I'm on RCP Council, And I was looking back up this book, and I actually think we are in as bad a place as we've ever been. In fact, a bad place before even the GMC existed, okay? This was the press in 1809 talking about Lucas Pepys, who was the president of Royal College of Physicians, responsible at the time for regulating doctors. He was nicknamed Lucas, as in looks like an ass, Pepys, for screwing up over the treatment of medical doctors in the Napoleonic Wars, okay? And now we have the GMC in 2018 and the Lancet being basically told they should resign. So I think we are in a worse state in medical regulation since the Napoleonic Wars, okay? And the only way this is going to change, and I'm afraid we have no influence on this, is actually Parliament, because Parliament regulates the GMC, which is why it's really important each one of us puts pressure on our MPs to say this is bonkers if we're taking this kind of attitude to doctors making honest errors. For reasons of time, I'll skip through this. So, black box thinking in the NHS, can we safely learn from mistakes? No, but I think there are solutions. I mean, we need reform of the GMC, and as I keep saying, someone in the room that understands the word analpril. We need to think about reform of the law and protection of reflection. I think reflection is very important, and this is much wider than just doctors. Think about the Honeyrose case, for example, and I think really encourage people to look at what happened in New Zealand. We've been in contact with the MPS in New Zealand, and doctors' reflections are legally protected. And I've spoken to colleagues who work in it. It's a very different ethos. We need to see a reform of the coroners because there's much too much variation. Is this something that the Healthcare Safety Investigation Bureau could perhaps look at, which is a body that was set up to mimic the Aircraft Investigation Bureau? And this inconsistent with Rule 28. I think there's great learning potentially from Rule 28. I basically think, why are they not on the web? And part of the problem I know is that there's a real backlog for coroners and reduce the risk of these mistakes happening. I think there does need to be reform of the CPS. To some extent that's already happening. As I've indicated, there have been no doctors charged with drug-related manslaughter since the David Nicholl conviction. Now, I just say people have looked at Scotland and think, there isn't a similar offence in Scotland is of corporate manslaughter, and no doctor is being is not I've forgotten the term.
Culpable homicide.
Culpable homicide. Yeah, thank you. Culpable homicide. But in fact, no doctor has ever been convicted of culpable homicide. Certainly from speaking to Ian Barker and others at the MDU, the lawyers feel actually be careful what you wish for. We're probably better off with the GNM law that we have in England. It's just the interpretation is probably what's wrong. It was certainly never intended to be used the way it is being used. And also this issue at trial, I feel very uncomfortable with the fact that serious incidents data isn't being shown in front of the jury. And also I think importantly we need, and maybe this is something the BMA needs to look at, is actually whistleblowing protection. And in fact Robert Francis identified this in Freedom to Speak Up a couple of years ago, that there needs to be reform of what's called the Public Interest Disclosure Act. I think this is terribly important. I'll just give you one example in one slide. The risk of being a whistleblower is Edward Jessetson. He was a professor of paediatric surgery in Alder Hey, basically, who became a patient safety concerns, took a case, and basically he refused to accept a gag. He wasn't prepared to accept a gagging order, basically. But he made a mistake, and the mistake was he chose, and this is a quote I got from Phil Hammond at Private Eye, basically. He chose to give him information to publish in Private Eye, all accurate, because he felt entirely reasonably that Trust, Royal College of Surgeons, CQC and the BMA had no interest in investigating the concerns because people were trying to get him to sign a gag. But that information was court documents. So then he's in the position where he's being asked, were you the source for Private Eye? So he's got the chance of being done for perjury. Okay? And of course he said so, then the BMA dropped the case. Okay? And as part of that, I got somewhat annoyed because in fact there was a video of him at the BMA annual conference some years ago which was on Vimeo. He got threatened and Vimeo withdrew that. I got a copy, stuck it on YouTube and told the BMA, if you want to take it off, you can sue me. Nothing's happened. And to show you some of the background, this was an email that was going around from the medical director at Alder Hey, basically. All of this is in Private Eye. There are only two possible outcomes: major restructuring with judges and returning triumph, or a very dirty fight and fully in the public eye. The attitude then was to try and report Phil Hammond to the GMC. So really dirty stuff. So going back to what I was saying, that's why I think whistleblower protection is really, really important. I think it's something that we need to think about, and it's because you get conflicts of interest between organisations that actually don't want the information coming out in the public domain. On a more pleasant note, I spoke to Adisa last night, and this is a video which she put together for Jenny Vaughn, which she just wanted to say thank you, and also has the interview in Newsnight where Jenny Vaughn was speaking to Nicola Alcock, Jack Alcock's mother.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude for all the support I've received from the medical profession. I'm amazed by the amount of support globally, people who have written to me, those who have spoken on my behalf, and those that have also contributed to the crowdfunding page. I'm overwhelmed with gratitude. Your support is one of the reasons why we kept going as a family. Like most of you, I went into medicine because I have a passion for it. One of the purposes of my life is to serve the community. When we graduated and took the Hippocratic Oath, we said we will treat patients to the best of our ability. One of the greatest difficulties that we have as medics is dealing with the death of a patient. However, nothing in medical school prepares us for criminal investigations. When I agreed to cover a colleague on the 18th of February 2011, I never realized that I was going to start that journey. A year later, I was arrested by the police and questioned because of an investigation into gross negligence manslaughter of my actions on that day. I recall my immediate fear was what was happening to my 2-week-old daughter, but another bigger fear I had was the possibility of going to prison. I was relieved 2 months later when the police informed me that the case has been closed. However, whilst I was on call on the 17th of December 2014, my consultant informed me that I had just been charged with gross negligence manslaughter. I remember being speechless and not knowing what would follow. In November 2015, I was convicted, and I recall the police officers putting the handcuffs on my hand. At that point, something changed inside me. I was placed in a cell for some hours while they discussed my bail conditions. And in that time, I remember writing about what will happen to my children and made other plans in case I was sentenced to prison. I am grateful for being here today. I'm very grateful for your support. And I also feel fortunate to be given an opportunity to practice medicine. My hope is that we can work together as a community to improve the working conditions of junior doctors and also improve patient safety. Thank you.
You're worried about what happens to medical professionals if doctors are struck off for this kind of thing.
Well, I think it's sad. We're actually all on the same side. Doctors are on the same side as patients here. What we want is a safe culture, and the only way you really get a safe culture is actually a no-blame culture, where people can be frank about the errors that they made, and they can discuss them and not feel challenged, and that they come out in the open and say, I did this wrong. That's the only way that you actually improve patient safety.
You would agree that there are some errors that are too gross to such gross negligence. You would say, sorry, you're just obviously not fit for this job.
Yes.
Doctors get struck off for fraud.
But in this particular case, the MPTS has heard all the evidence. That's the tribunal.
I mean, they did find that there were grotesque errors. I mean, in the day, and they said it was the fact that she had
and that she
redeemed herself by trying to...
She did nothing else. She has had honest failure. And basically, honest failure should not be rewarded with punishment and retribution. She has been suspended. She's had trial by media. A lot of things have happened.
Would you let her? This is Nikki's question. Yeah. Would you let her look after your child?
I absolutely would.
So I will sort of finish at this point. I encourage people to join, and we've kind of set up a campaign. Hashtag learn not blame, because I think learning from error is terribly important. I'm very grateful for the BMA at the annual conference. I described GMC as being truly exceptionally bad, which I think they have been. In fact, the only thing I've actually succeeded, you need to realise just how little the GMC have changed, because nothing has changed as a consequence of this case, okay? I can genuinely say the only thing I've managed to change is I went to the GMC on the 6th anniversary of the Medical Practitioner Tribunal Service, which is the 11th of June, I'm sure you have it in your diary, and brought them a Learn Not Blame birthday cake, and said I wanted to pay my GMC fee, but I refused to pay by direct debit because I believe they're using extortion, but I was quite happy to pay my GMC fee in post-dated cheques, okay? The only thing they've changed is their website to say they will refuse to take post-dated cheques, okay? That's the only thing that's changed, okay? They wouldn't even take the bloody cake, okay? So, you know, you need to realise what you're up against, okay? Everybody likes cake, but not the GMC. So, in fact, we're actually engaged in what I describe as GMC whack-a-mole. I think it's really important we keep going, because they just don't get it. But every single working doctor I've known does get this and are absolutely outraged. So I would encourage you to keep playing GMC whack-a-mole. Happy to take any questions.